The smoke smells different when a man is burning in it. On May 23, 1498, the air over Florence's Piazza della Signoria was thick, acrid, steeped in the stench of scorched flesh and unfulfilled prophecies. On the very spot where, just a year before, a cleansing fire, the bonfire of the Vanities, had soared to the heavens at this man's will, devouring priceless canvases, manuscripts, and lutes. 3 blackened bodies now twitched in their final convulsions. The central body, that of the Dominican friar Girolamo Savonarola, had already stilled. The crowd, which had recently hung on his every word, seeing in him a prophet and savior, now roared in a mixture of terror, relief, and primal ecstasy. This roar was an epitaph to the greatest paradox of the Renaissance. How did it happen that a friar who came to save the souls of Florentines from the fires of hell was himself consigned to the flames as a heretic? How did the city that gave the world Botticelli and Michelangelo, the cradle of humanism and beauty, so furiously first renounce its treasures, and then the one who forced it to do so? The main question left hanging in that smoky air was not about the guilt or sanctity of one man. It was about the very nature of power, faith, and madness. It was a question of how easily the greatest impulse for spiritual purification can turn into a totalitarian nightmare, and how the fire meant to burn sins ends up incinerating humanity itself, leaving behind only ashes and an eternal mystery, which we will now attempt to unravel. To understand this tragedy, we must go back several years, to a world that itself stood on the edge of an abyss, desperately in need of either a savior or an executioner. To understand how Florence could fall at the feet of so severe a prophet, one must breathe the air of that era, the air of the late 15th century, which was both intoxicating and toxic. Florence, under the rule of Lorenzo de' Medici, known as the Magnificent, was not just a city, it was a dream made manifest in marble and fresco. It was a diamond on the velvet cushion of Tuscany, the cultural capital of the world, where human genius seemed to touch the divine. Neoplatonist philosophers like Marsilio Ficino and Pico della Mirandola walked its streets, attempting to reconcile the wisdom of Plato with the teachings of Christ. In the workshops, Botticelli labored, his pagan Venuses and Christian Madonnas equally beautiful. A young Michelangelo absorbed anatomy, while Leonardo da Vinci sketched flying machines and angelic smiles in his notebooks. Golden florins, minted by the banking houses, were the world's currency, and Florentine silk and brocade clothed European monarchs. But this glittering facade concealed deep, rotting fissures. The power of the Medici, who were formerly just the first citizens of the Republic, was in fact a soft but pervasive tyranny built on money, bribes, and political intrigue. The luxury flaunted by the wealthy families existed alongside the appalling poverty of the city's outskirts. And over all of Italy, fragmented into warring city-states, loomed the shadow of Rome, where Rodrigo Borgia sat on the papal throne as Alexander VI, a man whose name became synonymous with debauchery, simony, and political assassination. The Church, which should have offered spiritual comfort, had itself become the primary source of scandal and cynicism. In this world of divine beauty and mortal sin, of intellectual breakthrough and moral decay, there was a sense of an impending end. People felt that the golden age could not last forever, that such pride and departure from the faith of their ancestors would inevitably be met with divine punishment. The air was electrified with the expectation of change, the anticipation of a voice that would dare to call things by their true names. And it was into this overripe, explosive atmosphere that a man was about to enter, his character forged, far from Florentine splendor, in shadow and asceticism, in a world with no room for halftones, only the light of God and the darkness of sin. The origins of Savonarola's anger and fervent faith are to be sought not in the bustling squares of Florence, but in the quiet, austere interiors of the city of Ferrara, under the rule of the d'Este dukes. He was born in 1452 into a family belonging to the world of science and humanism. His grandfather, Michele Savonarola, was a renowned physician and scholar, a man of the Renaissance. Young Girolamo was prepared for a similar career, destined for a future at the brilliant Ferrarese court. But from an early age, the boy saw the underside of this splendor. He saw not so much the revival of classical ideals as the revival of classical pagan debauchery, the lavish festivities, the political intrigues, the cynicism and cruelty of an aristocracy, where a murder could be ordered as easily as a new dress. All of it filled his soul not with admiration, but with the deepest revulsion. In his youthful writings, he called the world a hell, and Italy a land full of impiety, fornication, sodomy, and every kind of filth. This was not mere adolescent moralizing. It was an almost physical pain from the world's imperfection, a profound personal insult inflicted upon him by universal sin. At 23, against his family's wishes, he committed his first and greatest rebellion. He secretly left home and entered a Dominican monastery in Bologna. In a farewell letter to his father, he explained his action by the unbearable abomination of the world, saying he could no longer live among swine. This departure was not just a choice of a spiritual path. It was an escape, a complete rejection of everything his era valued: wealth, fame, humanistic learning, earthly love. He voluntarily chose shadow over light, silence over worldly conversation, a hair shirt over silk. In the monastery, he found what he was looking for: strict discipline, order, and the absolute truth of Holy Scripture. He immersed himself in the works of Augustine and Thomas Aquinas, but most of all, his soul was captured by the harsh prophets of the Old Testament and the apocalyptic visions of John the Revelator. There, in the silence of his cell, his youthful disgust with the world crystallized into a coherent theological system, where sin must be punished and purification is possible only through suffering and fire. It was in this break with the world, in this total rejection of human nature in its Renaissance manifestation, that the foundation of the future dictator of Florence was laid. He left the world only to one day return and remake it in his own image. Great historical figures rarely appear out of nowhere. Often, their arrival seems foretold by the era itself. In Savonarola's case, these omens were not mystical prophecies written in ancient books, but his own thunderous declarations, which he began to pour forth from the depths of his religious consciousness. After several years of monastic life, he began to preach, and it was then that not just a monk, but a prophet of an apocalyptic mold awakened within him. His mind, nourished by the visions of the Book of Revelation, saw history not as a series of political events, but as a grand divine drama approaching its bloody climax. In his sermons, three central, terrifying images constantly arose, the three theses of his future rule. First, the church will be scourged. He saw it not as the bride of Christ, but as the whore of Babylon from the Apocalypse, mired in luxury and simony, and he predicted that the wrath of God would soon fall upon its corrupt hierarchs. Second, after this scourging, the church will be renewed. He believed that from the fire and blood, a new, pure community of believers would be born, a true city of God on earth. And third, the most crucial thesis for his future destiny: all of this will happen soon, in their lifetime. This element of urgency, the sense that the end of times was already knocking at the door, transformed his sermons from abstract theological dissertations into a burning call for immediate repentance. The central image of his prophecies became the sword of the Lord, which would soon and swiftly descend upon the earth, upon sinful Italy. This sword was not a metaphor for him, but an almost real, tangible premonition. He spoke of a coming conqueror from the north, a new Cyrus, whom God would send to punish tyrants and cleanse the land. These visions, born in prayerful ecstasy and reinforced by a deep knowledge of Scripture, gave his words incredible power. He did not reason, he proclaimed on behalf of God. He did not suppose, he asserted. And when, years later, the armies of the French king would indeed descend upon Italy, this sword of the Lord would become for everyone tangible proof of his prophetic gift, transforming him from a simple friar into a man who seemed to speak with heaven itself. The years spent behind monastery walls were not a time of pacification for Girolamo Savonarola, but a period of forging a weapon. This was his personal smithy, where youthful maximalism and disgust for the world were hammered into an unbending character, sharp as a razor and utterly uncompromising. His day was scheduled to the minute. Long hours of prayer, the strictest fasting, mortification of the flesh, and most importantly, relentless immersion in the Holy Scriptures. Unlike many humanists of his time, who saw the Bible as a source of allegories and philosophical wisdom, Savonarola read it literally, especially its most fearsome pages. The stories of God's wrath, of prophets denouncing kings, of Sodom and Gomorrah wiped from the face of the earth for their sins, were not ancient legends to him, but a direct guide to action, a roadmap for a lost world. He didn't just study the prophets, he became one of them, absorbing their fury, their pain for desecrated holiness, and their absolute certainty in their own righteousness. This is precisely what defined his unique preaching style, entirely atypical for the Renaissance. When he was first sent to preach in Florence in 1482, he suffered a crushing failure. The sophisticated Florentine public, accustomed to elegant, polished speeches in the spirit of classical rhetoric, did not accept him. His rough, guttural voice, his sharp gestures, his Old Testament curses seemed barbaric and out of place. His sermons at the Church of San Lorenzo drew no more than 25 listeners. This humiliation could have broken anyone, but for Savonarola, it only confirmed that he was on the right path. He saw this rejection not as his own weakness, but as the deafness of a sinful world, unable to hear the voice of truth. He returned to northern Italy even more convinced of his mission. He realized that his task was not to please the ear, but to lance the abscesses on souls, not to persuade, but to unleash the full force of divine wrath upon the heads of sinners. This failure tempered him, turning his stubbornness into an unbreakable will, and his faith in his own righteousness into an absolute conviction of his chosenness. And when he returned to Florence a few years later, he would no longer be a humble friar, but a hardened warrior, ready for the decisive battle for the souls of an entire city. Destiny, or as Savonarola himself would have called it, providence, has a peculiar sense of irony. In 1490, the man most responsible for the fearsome preacher's return to Florence was none other than Lorenzo de' Medici, the city's de facto ruler and the embodiment of everything the friar despised. Lorenzo, a connoisseur of talent, had heard of Savonarola's growing fame as a preacher in other cities, and, perhaps at the urging of the philosopher Pico della Mirandola, facilitated his transfer to the monastery of San Marco. He expected to see another learned monk who would adorn the intellectual landscape of his capital. He could never have imagined that he was letting into his city the man who would become its gravedigger. From the very beginning, Savonarola behaved in a way that was not expected of him. He refused to pay the traditional courtesy visit to Lorenzo, declaring that he owed his election as prior of San Marco not to the Medici, but to God alone. This was an unheard-of challenge, the first tolling of the bell for the coming storm. His sermons in the monastery church, and later in the main cathedral of Santa Maria del Fiore, which could no longer accommodate all who wished to hear him, became the main event of city life. This was no longer the tongue-tied friar who had been ridiculed a few years earlier. Now his voice boomed like Old Testament thunder. His words were like hot coals. He did not speak. He painted vivid, terrifying pictures before the eyes of his flock. Angels descending from heaven with bowls of wrath, Rome mired in depravity, and a sword poised over the heads of the Florentines. He directly, without naming names, but in a way that everyone understood, denounced tyranny, usury, the luxury of the rich, and moral decay. "Tyrants," he cried from the pulpit, "you burden the poor with taxes, you devour the flesh of the people." Every such sermon was not just a spiritual instruction, but a political act, slowly but surely undermining the foundations of Medici power. He struck the most sensitive chord of Florentine society, the underlying discontent and fear of the future. He gave the common people a voice, clothing their vague anxieties in clear, biblical images. This was his first decisive step, his first bloodless, but no less important battle. He held no formal power yet, but he was already conquering a power far stronger, the power over the minds and hearts of thousands who saw in him not just a friar, but a long-awaited avenger and prophet. Behind the thundering sermons and the image of an ascetic speaking for God, there was a deep inner paradox that became the engine of all the subsequent drama. What truly drove Girolamo Savonarola? Was it pure, unadulterated faith and a sincere desire to save lost souls? Or was there an inner demon hiding behind this facade, a subtle form of pride and a thirst for power? The answer most likely lies in a complex mix of both these motives. There is no reason to doubt the sincerity of his revulsion toward sin and corruption. His asceticism was not for show. He truly lived as he preached, despising comfort and worldly goods. He undoubtedly believed he was a vessel of God's will, an instrument in the hands of providence. But it was this absolute certainty of his own chosenness that became his trap. Spiritual pride, which the Church Fathers considered one of the most dangerous sins, could easily disguise itself as zeal for God. Having convinced himself that he was the only one who knew the true path, he gradually began to see any disagreement with him not merely as opposition, but as a rebellion against God himself. His secret motivation, perhaps not even fully conscious, was a thirst not for the worldly power he so despised in the Medici and the popes, but for a total, spiritual power. He did not want to just govern the city. He wanted to recreate the souls of its inhabitants, to burn out of them with a hot iron everything he considered sin. The love of beauty, the thirst for knowledge, carnal joy, the very freedom of will. This was an ambition far more grandiose and dangerous than that of any secular tyrant. He sought to become not just the ruler of Florence, but its supreme moral legislator, its conscience, its spiritual dictator. Herein lay his inner demon. In the pursuit of holiness, he arrogated to himself the right to judge and punish, the right to decide what art was pleasing to God and what should be burned, which books led to salvation and which to hell. He began with a desire to free people from sin, but his hidden goal relentlessly led to shackling them in new, far more terrible chains, the chains of a fanatical ideology where there is no room for doubt, mercy, or freedom. Every system, no matter how strong, has its point of vulnerability. For Medici Florence, that point was the death of its leader, Lorenzo the Magnificent, in April of 1492. With his departure, the city lost not just a ruler, but its main stabilizer, who had maintained the delicate balance of a complex system of political and social forces. His son, Piero, nicknamed the Unfortunate, possessed neither his father's intellect nor his tact. The fragile equilibrium was shattered, and it was at this very moment that Savonarola's prophecies of coming punishment began to come true with terrifying accuracy. In the autumn of 1494, a massive army of the French king, Charles VIII, invaded Italy through the Alps. For all of Italy, this was a shock, but for Florence, it was the moment of truth. Charles was marching on Naples, but his path lay through Tuscany. Piero de' Medici, in a panic, surrendered key fortresses to the French without a fight, provoking an explosion of outrage in the city. The Florentines saw this not just as a political blunder, but as a national humiliation and betrayal. And then, Savonarola stepped onto the stage. While the city authorities were in disarray, he was the only one who remained calm and authoritative. He went to Charles VIII's camp as an envoy and spoke to the king not as a petitioner, but as an equal, as a prophet. He bluntly told Charles that he was the sword of the Lord, sent by God to punish Italy, but warned him against ravaging Florence, for it was the city of God. His courage and mystical authority made a huge impression on the superstitious king. Returning to the city, Savonarola became the hero of the day. On a wave of popular indignation against Piero's rule, the people rose up. The Medici family, which had ruled Florence for 60 years, was exiled in disgrace. Power in the city effectively passed into the hands of the friar from San Marco. His prophecy had come true. The sword had fallen upon Italy. The tyrants were cast out. Now he faced the task of building a new, holy city on the ruins of the old world. This was his moment of triumph, the moment when the power of his word materialized into real political authority, and Florence, holding its breath, waited to see where its new spiritual leader would take it. With the expulsion of the Medici, Florence faced a question about its future. The city, formerly a republic, had in reality forgotten how to govern itself. In this power vacuum, Savonarola's voice became decisive. From the cathedral pulpit, he laid out his political program, which was nothing less than a project to build a theocratic state. He convinced the Florentines to adopt a new constitution based on the Venetian model, with a grand council that was meant to be a bulwark against the return of tyranny. But above this earthly republican authority, he erected a heavenly one. At the climax of one of his sermons, throwing the crowd of thousands into a state of religious ecstasy, he proclaimed the one true ruler, the King of Florence, to be Jesus Christ. This symbolic act had enormous practical consequences. If Christ is king, then his laws, as set forth in the gospel, become the state constitution. And who is the chief interpreter of these laws? The prophet of God, Fra Girolamo, of course. Thus, without holding any official position, Savonarola became the de facto dictator of the city. Under his influence, Florence began to transform. Laws were passed against luxury, gambling, sodomy, and blasphemy. The atmosphere of a cheerful secular city was replaced by a grim, almost monastic one. The Florentine Republic became a geopolitical phenomenon, a state that tried to guide its foreign and domestic policy not by pragmatic interests, but by religious dogma. Savonarola dreamed that his new Jerusalem would become an example for all of sin-ridden Italy, that a great renewal of the entire Christian church would begin from Florence. He challenged not only the neighboring Italian states, Milan, Venice, the Papal States, which watched this radical experiment with alarm and bewilderment, but also time itself, attempting to turn back the course of history and erect on the site of the cradle of the Renaissance the severe Gothic cathedral of his ideal city of God. In Savonarola's brief but dazzlingly brilliant career as a political leader, ingenious tactical moves were inextricably intertwined with fatal strategic miscalculations. His greatest masterpiece was undoubtedly his virtuoso use of the moment. Like an expert surfer, he caught the perfect wave, composed of three elements: the deep internal crisis of Florentine society, dissatisfaction with Medici tyranny, and the external threat of the French invasion. He managed to accumulate all the fears and hopes of the citizens and channel them into a single current, becoming the only person to offer a clear and seemingly salvific way out of the chaos. He spoke to kings as a prophet, to the people as a father, and to his enemies as a judge. His ability to turn a fulfilled prophecy into political capital was truly brilliant. However, this very same faith in his prophetic mission became the source of his main strategic error. He seriously believed that a complex state like Florence could be governed solely by religious commandments, ignoring harsh reality. His fundamental miscalculation was the belief that human nature could be changed by the force of preaching and coercion. He wanted to turn the Florentines, with all their passions, their love of beauty, and their commercial acumen, into a nation of ascetic monks. It was a utopia doomed to fail. Furthermore, in the complex web of Italian politics, where everything was decided by alliances, money, and mercenary armies, his foreign policy, based on an alliance with France because its king was the sword of the Lord, and hostility to Rome because the Pope was the Antichrist, was catastrophically inflexible. He underestimated the power of his enemies, especially Pope Alexander VI, who was not only a spiritual leader, but also a skilled, ruthless politician. Savonarola was playing a divine game on a human chessboard, and while he moved the pieces according to his visions, his opponents followed the rules of realpolitik. Ultimately, his tactical genius, which allowed him to seize power, proved powerless against his strategic blindness, which inexorably led both him and his city to a tragic end. Every ascent to power inevitably creates two camps: those who rise with the leader and those whom he leaves below or pushes off his path. The political landscape of Florence in Savonarola's time was split in just this way, and this division deepened with each day of his rule. His most loyal and passionate allies were his followers, whom his opponents derisively called the Piagnoni, or the Weepers. They earned this nickname because their leaders' sermons often moved them to tears of repentance and religious ecstasy. The Piagnoni were mainly members of the middle class, small merchants and artisans, as well as common people who were tired of the aristocracy's arbitrary rule and saw Savonarola as their defender, a prophet who had restored their republican freedoms and promised divine justice. They sincerely believed in his mission and were ready to do anything to help him build the city of God on earth. At the other pole were his sworn enemies, called the Arrabbiati, the enraged. This was the old Florentine aristocracy, the wealthy patrician families who had thrived under the Medici and, under the new theocratic rule, lost their influence, privileges, and the ability to lead their accustomed, luxurious lifestyle. They hated Savonarola not only for his harsh laws, but also for giving power to the rabble. The Arrabbiati saw him as an upstart, a demagogue, destroying the glorious traditions of Florence. Besides them, supporters of the exiled Medici, the Paleschi, from palla, the ball, a symbol on the Medici coat of arms, were active in the shadows, waiting for an opportune moment for revenge. But Savonarola's most powerful enemy was a man hundreds of miles away from Florence, in the Vatican. Pope Alexander VI, Borgia, was the complete opposite of the Dominican friar. Worldly, cynical, and power-hungry, he saw Savonarola's activities not just as criticism of church morals, but as a direct threat to his authority. Open accusations of heresy and calls for a council to depose him were, for the Pope, a declaration of war. This deadly duel between the ascetic prophet from Florence and the corrupt pontiff from Rome became the central axis of the entire subsequent drama. It was a clash not just of two men, but of two worlds, and its outcome was to decide not only the fate of Savonarola, but the future of Florence itself. In the history of every revolution, there comes a moment when words must give way to actions, when ideology must materialize into something tangible and irreversible. For Savonarola's theocratic revolution, that moment, his personal Rubicon, was the Bonfire of the Vanities on February 7th, 1497. Before this, he had mostly preached, denounced, and called for repentance. Now, he moved to the direct, physical destruction of everything that, in his view, poisoned the souls of the Florentines. The idea was simple and terrifying. To purify the city, one had to burn all the vanities that lead to sin. Throughout the city, his loyal followers, especially squads of boys he had organized into a kind of morality police, went from house to house, collecting tribute for the bonfire. They confiscated playing cards and dice, mirrors, cosmetics, perfumes, luxurious dresses, and carnival masks. But most terrifyingly, they took objects of art and culture. Books with secular content, especially Boccaccio's Decameron and the poetry of Ovid, musical instruments considered too sensual, and paintings with mythological, pagan subjects were all destined for the flames. According to contemporary accounts, the famous painter Sandro Botticelli, deeply impressed by Savonarola's sermons, himself brought and threw several of his works into the fire. In the city's main square, the Piazza della Signoria, a huge pyramid of these confiscated treasures was erected. To the singing of religious hymns and the sound of trumpets, it was set ablaze. It was a spectacle both majestic and nightmarish. For Savonarola's supporters, it was an act of great purification, a sacrifice to God, a rejection of a sinful past for the sake of a holy future. But for his opponents, and indeed for all of European culture, it was an act of vandalism, a declaration of war on beauty, knowledge, and the freedom of the human spirit. That day, Savonarola crossed the line separating a spiritual leader from a fanatical dictator. He was not just burning things, he was burning the soul of the Renaissance, and this fire, intended to purify Florence, would ultimately turn against him, and the very same square would become the site of his own execution. Every leader who reaches the summit is stalked by a fatal danger the ancient Greeks called hubris, a pride that challenges the gods and fate. Having reached the peak of his power, Girolamo Savonarola fell into this very sin, but in its Christian form. He came to believe so strongly in his divine mission that he no longer saw the difference between the will of the Lord and his own. His pride manifested in the open and contemptuous challenge he threw down to the most powerful figure in the Christian world, Pope Alexander VI. The conflict between them had been smoldering for a long time, but now it erupted into open flame. The Pope, irritated by the constant attacks and Florence's political alliance with his enemy, France, first tried to pacify the defiant friar. He offered him a cardinal's hat, hoping to buy his silence. Savonarola scornfully rejected the offer, declaring from the pulpit that the only red hat he would accept was that of a martyr, stained with his own blood. After this, he went on the direct offensive. In his sermons, which grew increasingly furious, he stopped criticizing the church in general and focused all his fire on the person of the pontiff. He called Alexander VI nothing less than a simoniac, a heretic, and the Antichrist, openly declaring that his election had been uncanonical and that such a man could not be the vicar of Christ on earth. He wrote letters to all the European monarchs, urging them to convene a general council to depose the apostate pope. This was an unheard of, unprecedented step. In the hierarchical world of the 15th century, a simple friar dared not just to criticize the pope, but to declare him deposed and call for a rebellion against him. At that moment, Savonarola ceased to be a mere reformer. He imagined himself the supreme judge of the entire church, the sole bearer of truth, standing above the entire canonical structure. This was his moment of hubris, the peak of his power, and simultaneously the beginning of his end. By challenging Rome, he turned his most powerful enemy into a mortal one, who would now use all his authority, both spiritual and political, to destroy the audacious Florentine prophet. No dictatorship of the spirit, no matter how strong, can last forever if it is not supported by daily bread and a sense of security. While Savonarola waged his holy war against Rome, the first deep cracks began to appear in the foundation of his power within Florence itself. 4 years of austerity, religious tension, and political isolation began to take their toll on the city's life. The economy, deprived of its former luxury commissions and suffering from the rupture of trade relations with the Papal States, was in decline. The common townspeople, who had initially welcomed the cheap government and laws against usurers with enthusiasm, now began to feel the consequences. Prices were rising, and work was becoming scarcer. To top it all off, in 1497, an epidemic of the plague struck the city, claiming many lives and being perceived by many not as a divine trial, but as a sign of divine displeasure. The atmosphere of universal penance and spiritual uplift gradually gave way to fatigue, irritation, and sullen discontent. The prohibitions that had at first seemed salutary now appeared as an unbearable burden. The Florentines began to long for their festivals, their songs, for the bright colors of life that had been outlawed. Whispers on the streets grew louder. Savonarola's enemies, the Arrabbiati, sensing the shift in mood, intensified their activities. They staged provocations, disrupted sermons, and distributed satirical poems and pamphlets mocking the prophet and his weeping followers. The conflict with the Pope also created a rift in society. Many pious Florentines, even those who sympathized with the reforms, were horrified by the open rebellion against the head of the church. They feared that the entire city would be placed under an interdict, excommunication from the church sacraments, which for a medieval person was tantamount to spiritual catastrophe. The air of Florence, once filled with hope for renewal, now thickened with the premonition of civil conflict. Faith in the prophet began to waver. These were the first, but ominous, harbingers of the storm that was already gathering over Savonarola's head. His power, built on the force of his word and the fear of God, was beginning to falter in the face of far more worldly problems: hunger, disease, and weariness. Every war, whether political or spiritual, has its turning points, after which there is no going back. In the deadly duel between Girolamo Savonarola and Pope Alexander VI, that fatal act was the preacher's official excommunication from the church. On May 12, 1497, the Pope, having exhausted all attempts to reason with or bribe the recalcitrant friar, delivered his most powerful blow. In a special bull, he accused Savonarola of heresy, disobedience to the Apostolic See, and spreading false doctrines. Fra Girolamo was declared excommunicated from the body of the church, and all the faithful were forbidden, under pain of the same excommunication, to listen to his sermons, communicate with him, or provide him with any support. For Savonarola and his Theocracy, this was a blow of colossal force. In a world where all life, from birth to death, was permeated with religion, excommunication was tantamount to spiritual death. It was the most powerful tool of authority at the pontiff's disposal. Savonarola's authority, built on his status as a priest and prophet, was cut down at its very foundation. How can one speak for God if the vicar of God on earth has declared him an apostate? This question hung over Florence, splitting it definitively. The Arrabbiati and the friar's other enemies rejoiced. Now they held a legal, canonical weapon to fight him. Even many of his supporters were confused and frightened. The government of Florence, the Signoria, found itself in a most difficult position. To obey the Pope meant to hand over their spiritual leader and admit defeat. To disobey meant to bring papal wrath, an interdict, and a trade blockade upon the city. Savonarola, however, had no intention of surrendering. He committed the most audacious act of his life. He declared the papal excommunication null and unjust, stating that it came from a corrupt and illegitimate pontiff, and that one should appeal not to the Pope, but directly to God. He continued to say Mass and preach, turning his conflict with Rome into an open schism. But the fateful step had been taken. The mark of the apostate, placed upon him by Rome, became an indelible stain that slowly but surely eroded his power and prepared the ground for his tragic fall. Having received the bull of excommunication, Savonarola not only did not retreat, but launched a furious counterattack, unleashing an unprecedented war of proclamations and sermons against Rome. He turned the pulpit of the Florence Cathedral into a tribunal from which he waged his personal war against Pope Borgia. His logic was bold and revolutionary for the time. He argued that an unjust excommunication has no power before God. When a superior commands something contrary to the commandments of God, he thundered, addressing thousands of listeners frozen in suspense, the subordinate is not obliged to obey. He appealed to a higher authority, to conscience, and to direct communication with the Lord, effectively questioning the entire hierarchical structure of the Catholic Church. These were ideas that anticipated Martin Luther's theses by half a century. He did not just defend himself, he attacked. He publicly burned the papal bull, comparing himself to the first Christian martyrs and Alexander VI to Nero. His rhetoric reached a fever pitch of fury. He called the papal court a house of debauchery, and the Pope himself a broken tool that God would soon cast aside. This war was not fought with words alone. Savonarola and his supporters began to actively distribute his letters and treatises throughout Europe, trying to convey their position to European monarchs and cardinals, convincing them of the need to convene a council to save the Church. Florence became a center of anti-papal propaganda. However, this desperate courage had a downside. It definitively split the city. For the Piagnoni, their leader became a true martyr, a new St. Paul standing against a corrupt empire. But for a vast number of moderate and devout citizens, his actions were a shocking act of disobedience and pride. They had been raised in age-old reverence for the Apostolic See, and the idea that one could simply ignore an excommunication seemed blasphemous. The Arrabbiati, meanwhile, gained a powerful trump card. Now they were fighting not just a political opponent, but an official, Rome-branded heretic and schismatic. This war of words, this battle for minds and souls, escalated the situation to the extreme, making any compromise impossible. Savonarola had burned all his bridges, and now there could be only one outcome. Either he would achieve the Pope's deposition, or the Pope would destroy him. To maintain power in a fracturing city and bring his holy revolution to its conclusion, Savonarola increasingly relied on the most unusual and frightening instrument of his regime, the fanciulli, squads of children and teenagers, whom he turned into his personal morality police. He proceeded from the idea that children, due to their innocence, were more receptive to divine truth and uncorrupted by the sins of adults. He organized them into a quasi-military structure with their own captains and rules. These boys, dressed in white robes and carrying red crosses, became the eyes and ears of the Theocracy. Their task was to monitor the enforcement of the harsh laws. They patrolled the streets, cracking down on any signs of vanity. They would stop women to criticize their overly luxurious attire or use of cosmetics, confiscate playing cards and dice from gamblers, and force merchants to close their shops on feast days. Their power was immense and almost unchecked. The most chilling manifestation of their activities was the raids on homes before the Bonfire of the Vanities. They had the right to burst into private dwellings and demand the surrender of sinful objects. They stopped at nothing, informing on their own parents if they tried to hide a forbidden book or musical instrument. Joy, laughter, flirtation, bright clothing, all became suspicious, potentially criminal. Florence, once a city of carnivals and festivities, plunged into an atmosphere of fear and universal suspicion. Children, who for centuries had been taught to respect their elders, now became their judges and overseers. This system not only destroyed traditional family values, but also created an unbearable atmosphere of total control, where anyone could become the target of denunciation by a neighbor or even their own child. The fanciulli were the most vivid and terrifying symbol of what Savonarola's dream of a city of God had become, a totalitarian regime that, in the name of saving the soul, sought to destroy freedom itself and a person's private space. This reliance on children, which at first seemed a brilliant move to cultivate a new, pure generation, ultimately backfired, provoking deep revulsion even among many of his former supporters. Against the backdrop of growing discontent and constant pressure from Rome, Savonarola seemed to decide to go all in, doubling down in his desperate game. He announced a second Bonfire of the Vanities for February 1498, intended to surpass the first in scale and demonstrate to the world that Florence's will was not broken and its loyalty to the prophet was unshakable. This was an act of pure political theater, a desperate attempt to rally his wavering supporters and intimidate his enemies. Preparations for this event were carried out with even greater zeal and fanaticism. The fanciulli once again scoured the city, and this time their demands were even stricter. Not only luxury items, but also objects of immense cultural and scientific value were destined for the flames. According to some accounts, unique manuscripts, works of classical authors, anatomical drawings, and astrological tables were thrown into the fire. Anything that could be associated with pagan wisdom or diabolical curiosity that distracted from thoughts of God. An even more grandiose pyramid, topped with a figure of Satan, was erected in the Piazza della Signoria. It was the apotheosis of madness, a ritualistic suicide of culture taken to its logical extreme. The spectacle, according to eyewitness descriptions, was both grand and repulsive. A huge crowd watched as the flames devoured treasures that only a few years earlier had been the pride of their city. But the atmosphere no longer held the same unanimous ecstasy that had accompanied the first bonfire. Now, in the eyes of many, one could read not only fanaticism, but also fear, bewilderment, and hidden resistance. This second, even more monstrous bonfire did not strengthen Savonarola's power, but on the contrary, demonstrated its agony. It showed that for the regime to survive, it had to resort to increasingly radical and destructive measures. Instead of purifying the city, this fire only burned away the remaining sympathy for the prophet in the souls of many Florentines, and convinced his enemies that this madness had to be stopped as soon as possible, at any cost. The tension in Florence had reached a boiling point. Savonarola's enemies, sensing the ground slipping from under his feet, were looking for a way to strike a decisive blow against his authority, and they found it at his most sensitive point: his claim to the status of a prophet who worked miracles. The initiative came from the Franciscan friars, longtime rivals of the Dominican order, to which Savonarola belonged. One of them, Fra Francesco di Puglia, preaching in the church of Santa Croce, openly challenged Savonarola. If he were truly a prophet of God, let him prove it by walking through fire unscathed. It was a cunning and cruel move. In the medieval mind, the trial by ordeal was a very real way of determining the truth. To refuse such a challenge would be tantamount to admitting he was an impostor. Savonarola initially tried to evade it, saying that one should not tempt the Lord and demand miracles on command. But the pressure was too great. His most devoted supporter, Fra Domenico da Pescia, in a fit of fanatical faith, declared that he himself was ready to walk into the fire to prove the truth of his master's cause. The situation spiraled out of control. The Arrabbiati and the Signoria, seeing a perfect opportunity to be rid of the prophet, seized upon the idea. They officially set the date and place for the trial by fire, April 7th, 1498, in the Piazza della Signoria. The entire city held its breath. This was the final, desperate gamble. All of Savonarola's mystical authority, all his power, built on the belief in his supernatural connection to God, was now staked on a single miracle. If his champion walked through the flames, his power would become absolute. If he burned, or if the trial was called off, it would be the end of everything. The fate of the theocratic republic was to be decided in the roaring flames of a pyre, and all of Florence, from the youngest to the oldest, prepared to witness this grand and terrifying spectacle. The 7th of April, 1498, was meant to be the day of Savonarola's ultimate triumph or his complete downfall. From early morning, the Piazza della Signoria was packed with people. In the center of the square, a long platform had been built, flanked on both sides by piles of kindling and oil-soaked wood, leaving only a narrow passage in the middle. The tension was almost palpable. At the appointed hour, 2 processions arrived in the square: the somber Franciscans and the jubilant Dominicans, led by Fra Domenico, who was ready to enter the fire. Savonarola himself was not with him, which already caused a murmur in the crowd. And then began a spectacle that very quickly devolved into an outright farce. First, the Franciscans demanded that Fra Domenico remove his monastic robes, suspecting they might be treated with some fire-resistant substance. The Dominicans agreed. Then an argument broke out over the crucifix that Fra Domenico wanted to carry into the fire. The Franciscans vehemently objected, declaring it a sacrilege to risk a sacred image in such a dubious enterprise. Savonarola, having arrived at the square, intervened and suggested his champion take the Holy Host instead. This caused an even greater scandal. Arguments, bickering, and theological debates dragged on for hour after hour. The crowd, thirsty for a miracle or at least a bloody spectacle, began to lose patience. The sun was setting, and the friars were still arguing. The people who had stood in the square for many hours without food or water began to grumble. Their reverence turned to irritation, and then to outright anger. And at that moment, as if by a twist of fate, the heavens that were supposed to deliver a miracle opened up with a cold spring downpour. Rain lashed the square, soaking the firewood, and extinguishing any hope of conducting the trial. The Signoria officially announced the cancellation of the ordeal. This farce in the city's main square was a catastrophe for Savonarola, far worse than if his champion had burned. Had he burned, he would have become a martyr. But the failure of the trial due to petty squabbles and a sudden rain shower made him and his followers look ridiculous, pathetic. The magic was broken. The miracle had not happened, and the wrath of a crowd, cheated of its expectations, was ready to fall upon the one who had promised that miracle. The failure of the trial by fire was the spark that ignited the powder keg of popular anger. For the tens of thousands of Florentines gathered in the square, it was not just a disappointment, it was an insult, a public humiliation. They felt deceived. The entire complex, mystical aura surrounding Savonarola burst in an instant, like a soap bubble. He was no longer a prophet who spoke with God. He was an ordinary man who had failed to keep his promise. And the love of the crowd, as irrational and passionate as its faith had been, instantly turned into ferocious hatred. As the Dominican processions returned to their monastery of San Marco, under a hail of jeers and curses, the atmosphere in the city had already reached its breaking point. Savonarola's enemies, the Arrabbiati, immediately seized the moment. Their agents began to incite the crowd, shouting that the friar was an impostor and a fraud, that he had been leading the whole city by the nose. The next day, Palm Sunday, the riots began. A stone thrown at one of the Piagnoni during a service in the cathedral was the signal for the start of the pogrom. A huge, enraged mob, armed with whatever came to hand, stones, sticks, torches, marched on the monastery of San Marco, which had transformed from a sanctuary and center of power into a besieged fortress. Those who just yesterday had listened to Savonarola's sermons with tears in their eyes were now furiously breaking down the gates, demanding the false prophet be handed over. The handful of loyal supporters who remained with the friar tried to organize a defense. A full-scale assault began. The attackers set fire to the gates and climbed the walls, while from the monastery windows, a few armed friars fired back. Savonarola, who had always preached nonviolence, fell into a state of prostration, praying at the altar while battle raged around him. The shattering of his myth was total and final. He had lost not just power, he had lost his flock, his people, who now thirsted for his blood. The magic flute of the Pied Piper had broken, and the enchanted children had awakened, transformed into a merciless pack, ready to tear apart their erstwhile idol. The assault on the monastery of San Marco lasted for several hours, turning the abode of peace and prayer into a bloody battlefield. In the end, under pressure from the Signoria, which sent an official order, and seeing the futility of further resistance, Girolamo Savonarola, along with his two closest associates, Fra Domenico da Pescia and Fra Silvestro Maruffi, surrendered to the authorities. The moment of his arrest was the symbolic end of his 4-year reign. From a prophet whose voice made the entire city tremble, he became a defenseless prisoner with his hands tied behind his back. He was led through the night streets of Florence to the Palazzo Vecchio, and his followers of yesterday, who once knelt before him, now showered him with curses, spat on him, and tried to strike him. It was not just an arrest, it was a ritual of public downfall. He was imprisoned in a small cell in the tower, ironically called the Alberghetto, the Little Hotel, the very same one where Cosimo de' Medici the Elder had once been held before his exile. History had come full circle. The man who had expelled the Medici and destroyed their world now occupied their prison cell. From that moment, Savonarola's fate was sealed. Power in the city had completely passed to his enemies, the Arrabbiati, who craved not justice, but revenge, and a swift restoration of peace with Rome. For them, Savonarola's trial was necessary, not to uncover the truth, but to legitimize his execution and put an end to his legacy once and for all. They had to prove to the entire city and the world that he was not a prophet, but a fraud, not a saint, but a heretic. And to achieve this goal, they were prepared to use any means necessary. Savonarola's transition from the status of a spiritual dictator to that of a prisoner was swift and irrevocable. He had lost everything: his power, his freedom, and most importantly, his mystical aura. Now he was merely a man of flesh and blood, and that flesh was about to be subjected to the cruelest trials to break his spirit. Immediately after the arrest, a trial began that, from the outset, was not an investigation, but a political reprisal. The goal of the new Florentine authorities and the papal commissioners who arrived from Rome was singular: to extract a confession from Savonarola that all his prophecies were lies and deceit. To do this, they resorted to the most effective means of medieval justice: torture. For nearly 40 days, intermittently, Girolamo Savonarola was subjected to the most brutal torments. He was repeatedly interrogated with vigor, primarily using the strappato, a rack where the victim's hands were tied behind his back, attached to a rope, and he was hoisted into the air with sharp jerks, causing his joints to dislocate. For a middle-aged man whose body was emaciated by fasting and vigils, these tortures were unbearable. His physical shell broke. Under the influence of hellish pain, his will was shattered. Between bouts of agony, when he was returned, maimed, to his cell, he would recant his confessions, only to sign them again under the threat of more torture. The surviving interrogation transcripts are a horrifying document, testifying to how methodically and cold-bloodedly a man was broken. In them, Savonarola confesses that he acted out of vanity and a desire for worldly fame, that his visions were fabrications, and his prophecies were the result of studying the Bible and observing the political situation. His enemies got what they wanted. They obtained an official, signed recantation of everything he had taught. It didn't matter that these confessions were extracted under torture. What mattered was that they could now be read before the people to completely destroy his image in the eyes of even his most devoted followers. The process of torture was not just physical violence, it was the ritual murder of a myth. Before killing the prophet's body, they had to kill his spirit, his idea. They wanted to show that beneath the mantle of a saint hid an ordinary, weak, deceitful man. And in this, using the most inhuman methods, they succeeded. After the necessary confessions had been tortured out of Savonarola and his two companions, the final act of this tragedy began: the official trial and sentencing. The tribunal was presided over by two papal commissioners, specially sent by Alexander VI, which emphasized that this was not just an internal Florentine matter, but an affair of the entire church. The process was a pure formality. The confessions obtained under torture were the main and only evidence of guilt. There were no defense witnesses, no theological disputes in which Savonarola had been so formidable. He and his companions were charged on 3 main counts: heresy, for spreading false teachings and disobeying the Pope; schism, for fracturing the unity of the Church; and rebellion against lawful authority. On May 22, 1498, the verdict was announced. Girolamo Savonarola, Fra Domenico da Pescia, and Fra Silvestro Maruffi were found guilty on all counts and sentenced to death. First, they were to be defrocked, and then handed over to the secular authorities for the sentence to be carried out. The ceremony of degradation was conducted with humiliating cruelty. The bishop performing the rite, in his agitation, mixed up the formula and said, I separate you from the church militant and from the church triumphant, that is, from heaven." Savonarola, not losing his presence of mind even at this moment, corrected him. "From the militant, yes, but from the triumphant, no, for that is not in your power." These were among his last words, in which a shadow of the indomitable prophet he once was flickered. The sentence surprised no one. It had been decided in advance, at the very moment the crowd turned against him. It was a political necessity for the new government of Florence to appease the Pope and bring the city back into the fold of normal European politics. The execution was set for the next morning in the city's main square. The circle was now complete. The fire he had lit to purify Florence was now ready to consume him. The end of Girolamo Savonarola's life became a mirror image of his greatest act, a dark and ironic rhyme to the Bonfire of the Vanities. The execution was set for the very same Piazza della Signoria, in the heart of the city where he once reigned as the undisputed spiritual sovereign. A huge platform was constructed, upon which a gallows was erected, with piles of firewood stacked beneath it. The irony of fate was cruel and obvious to all. The man who burned Vanities to save people's souls was now to ascend a pyre himself. The city he tried to turn into an ascetic monastery was now preparing to make a public spectacle of his death, returning to its old, pagan habits. The paradox at the very heart of his teaching, salvation through destruction, now turned against him. He wanted to destroy the sinful flesh of the world, and in the end, the world prepared to destroy his own flesh. On the morning of May 23, 1498, he and his two companions were led out to the square. They walked past the tribunal, where those who had condemned them sat, and ascended the scaffold. They were first hanged, and then, while their bodies were still twitching in agony, the pyre was lit. The flame, which he had so often invoked in his sermons as a symbol of divine wrath and purification, now consumed his mortal shell. The crowd watching the execution behaved in various ways. Some gloated and threw stones into the fire. Others were silent in horror, while a third group, his former supporters, secretly wept as they watched their prophet turn to ash. This final act wasn't just the execution of a man. It was the symbolic end of an entire era in the life of Florence. The city, as if waking from a feverish dream, was burning its recent past, trying with fire to exorcise the memory of the stern friar who had forced it to gaze into the abyss of its own soul and to hoard its own beautiful face. The fire that was meant to purify Florence ultimately purified it of Savonarola himself, allowing it to return to its former joys, its art, and its sins. After the fire had done its work, and only ashes remained of the three friars' bodies, the Florentine authorities made one last attempt to erase Girolamo Savonarola from history. They feared that his supporters would gather his remains and turn them into relics, and that his grave would become a place of pilgrimage. A martyr's cult could become the banner for a new rebellion. Therefore, an order was given to carefully collect all the ashes and dust from the execution site and throw them into the Arno River from the old bridge, the Ponte Vecchio. This gesture was deeply symbolic. The river, the city's main artery, was to carry away the last traces of the prophet's presence on this earth, to dissolve him without a trace, leaving nothing for memory to cling to. But as often happens in history, the attempt at total annihilation leads to the opposite result. Lacking a grave to visit, the memory of Savonarola did not die, but became more elusive and pervasive, turning into a legend, an idea. Despite all the authorities' efforts, on the night after the execution, several devoted women secretly came to the square and collected a handful of ashes from the stones that had not been swept into the river. These specks became secret relics, Savonarola's death did not end his story, but merely began its new, posthumous chapter. He was gone, but the questions he had raised remained. Was he a saint or an impostor? A martyr or a madman? His execution provided no answers, but only made these questions eternal. By physically destroying him, his enemies unwittingly contributed to his transformation into an immortal symbol. A symbol of the tragic struggle for the purity of faith, a symbol of the dangers of fanaticism, a symbol of the unarmed prophet who tried to remake the world with words alone and was torn apart and destroyed by that world. The river Arno carried away his ashes, but it could not carry away his story, which for centuries remained inscribed in the memory of Florence and the entire world. Savonarola's death immediately gave rise to polar opposite assessments of his personality and legacy, and this duality has persisted for centuries. In the eyes of his enemies in Florence and Rome, he was and remained a dangerous heretic, a rebel, and a false prophet who plunged a prosperous city into chaos, tried to split the church, and was justly punished. For them, he was a grim reminder of what religious fanaticism leads to. However, just a few decades later, when Martin Luther nailed his 95 Theses to a church door in Germany, the figure of Savonarola was viewed in a completely different light. The Protestant reformers saw him as their direct predecessor, a forerunner of the Reformation. They admired his bold criticism of the papacy, his call for the renewal of the church, and his appeal to the authority of the Bible as being higher than that of the pontiff. For them, his execution was a martyrdom for the true faith, and he himself was one of the first victims in the fight against the tyranny of Rome. Within the Catholic Church itself, the attitude towards him was also ambiguous. Although he was executed as a heretic, many prominent Catholic figures, including saints like Philip Neri and Catherine de' Ricci, revered him as a holy man. In the 19th and 20th centuries, the question of his possible beatification, being declared blessed, was raised several times, and this process, though not completed, shows how complex and ambiguous his figure remains, even for the official church. A special assessment was given to him by his contemporary, the brilliant political philosopher Niccolò Machiavelli. For him, the story of Savonarola was not a matter of faith, but a textbook example of a political mistake. In his treatise, The Prince, Machiavelli categorized Savonarola as one of the unarmed prophets who, unlike armed prophets, such as Moses, are doomed to perish. They can captivate the people with their ideas, but when the crowd cools and ceases to believe, they lack the force, an army, to make them believe by force. This cold, pragmatic assessment is perhaps the closest to unraveling his political tragedy. Thus, Savonarola has remained in history as a two-faced Janus. For some, a holy martyr. For others, a dangerous fanatic. For a third group, a naive politician. But for all, a grand and tragic figure whose legacy still provokes fierce debate. So how can we, more than 5 centuries later, solve the central dramatic paradox of Savonarola? How did a friar who sincerely wished to save souls turn into a tyrant who burned culture and joy? The answer cannot be simple, for it lies not in the plane of saint or madman, but in the tragic dialectic of human nature and power itself. Savonarola was not a cynical deceiver or a charlatan lusting for worldly power in its primitive sense. His faith was genuine, his asceticism sincere, his anger at corruption righteous. Herein lies the first part of his tragedy. His best qualities, taken to the extreme, became his worst vices. His unwavering faith grew into a fanaticism that tolerated no dissent. His striving for purity turned into a totalitarian intolerance of all things human. His righteous anger transformed into cruelty. He sincerely loved God, But this love, in his distorted understanding, made him hate God's creations, art, knowledge, freedom, and the imperfect but living human nature itself. The second part of the solution lies in the phenomenon of power. Having gained absolute spiritual and then political authority at a moment of profound crisis, he fell victim to its greatest temptation, the conviction of his own infallibility. By convincing himself that he was a direct instrument in God's hands, he arrogated to himself the right to decide for everyone what was good and what was evil. The paradox is resolved right here. He became a tyrant, not in spite of his faith, but because of it. His theocracy was not a betrayal of his ideals, but their logical, monstrous conclusion. He wanted to build heaven on earth, but since people did not want to voluntarily enter his version of heaven, he decided to force them in, burning everything that stood in the way. His story is an eternal reminder that there is nothing more dangerous than absolute certainty in one's own righteousness, especially when it is backed by power. He was neither an angel nor a demon. He was a man whose grandiose dream of holiness, when confronted with reality, spawned a nightmare. The story of Girolamo Savonarola, the friar who for 4 years subjugated the cradle of the Renaissance, extends far beyond the biography of one man or one city. It is a universal myth, an eternal parable about the temptations and dangers of ideological purity. His fate confronts us with fundamental questions that have lost none of their relevance today. Where is the invisible line where deep faith turns into blind fanaticism? At what point does righteous anger at the world's imperfections become a destructive hatred for everything living and free? And how is it that the desire to build a perfect society so often leads to the creation of a totalitarian prison? Savonarola's story is a warning. It shows how easily a society in a state of crisis, fear, and confusion can fall for the allure of a simple and radical answer offered by a charismatic leader who promises salvation in exchange for freedom. It demonstrates that the enemy of humanism and culture can be not only an external barbarian, but also an internal rigorist who, in the name of a higher goal, is willing to burn books, paintings, and human joy itself. The fire in the Piazza della Signoria died out more than 500 years ago, but we can see its reflections throughout subsequent history. In the bonfires of the Inquisition, in the ideological purges of the 20th century, in contemporary calls for censorship and the destruction of harmful art. Savonarola is the eternal archetype of the virtue-armed, the man so convinced of his own rightness that he is willing to destroy the world to save it. And the main lesson of his tragedy is simple and timeless. Any ideology that promises absolute truth and demands absolute obedience inevitably ends in a bonfire, first for books and then for people. And as we look at the smoke that rose over Florence on that May day, we must remember that this smoke is an eternal reminder of the fragility of freedom, the value of doubt, and the terrible price humanity pays for the dream of heaven on earth.